The night was heavy with silence, the kind that made even the faintest noise feel intrusive. A dim streetlight flickered near the corner, casting long, broken shadows across the pavement. A house stood alone at the end of the street, modest and unassuming, the type that wouldn't attract attention. But in the darkness, figures moved with careful precision, their steps muffled by the damp ground. 3 of them, dressed in black, scanning their surroundings before approaching the house. Their movements were swift, practiced. This wasn't their first time. Inside, Julian Martinez sat in his worn armchair, a book open in his lap. The words blurred together as his eyelids grew heavy. At 68, his life was one of quiet routine. Retirement suited him. Early mornings in his garden, afternoons watching the neighborhood from his porch, and nights with a book in hand. He was just an old man now, a simple resident in a simple home. Or so it seemed. The faintest creak outside snapped his eyes open. Years of habit, of training, sent a chill through his spine. He closed the book, listening. Another sound, a soft scrape against the doorframe. His fingers twitched, not in fear but in recognition. He had heard these sounds before. Memories he had long buried stirred awake. The instincts, the reflexes, the past he had worked so hard to leave behind. Something was coming. Julian inhaled slowly, steadying himself. He had promised he would never go back, never pick up the pieces of the life he once lived. But as the shadows moved outside his window, he realized something. Sometimes the past doesn't stay buried, and sometimes it comes knocking. The street was quiet, wrapped in the familiar calm of a neighborhood long accustomed to uneventful nights. Most houses were dark, their residents already deep in sleep. A few porch lights flickered, casting pale glows on the pavement, but nothing seemed out of place, nothing that an untrained eye would notice. Julian Martinez sat in his living room, the book still resting in his lap, but his attention was no longer on the words. His ears had caught something, a noise too faint for most to register, but enough to stir something deep within him. It had been decades since he had lived by instinct, but some things never truly left. Another sound, a careful step. His house was one of the oldest on the street, with wooden floors that betrayed every movement, but outside on the damp ground beneath the window, someone was moving deliberately. Julian shifted slightly, his body tense, his breathing controlled. He knew his neighborhood well. The Morales family lived next door, a young couple with a baby who often cried in the middle of the night. 2 houses down, old Senora Gomez rarely turned off her television before midnight. The Vargas brothers always played music too loudly on weekends. It was an ordinary place filled with ordinary people. And yet, tonight, something was out of place. He didn't move immediately. Instead, he listened. Years of discipline had taught him patience, observation. There were at least 3 of them. Their footsteps were too light for construction workers or late-night drunks. They weren't teenagers playing a prank either. These were people who knew how to move unnoticed. Burglars. Julian's fingers curled over the armrest of his chair. His first instinct was to act, but he hesitated. He had left that life behind. He was just a retired man now. A soft thud came from the back of the house. They were inside. His pulse quickened, but his hands were steady as he stood. His body, though aged, still remembered how to move without sound. He reached for the walking cane leaning beside the chair, not because he needed it, but because it was always better to look harmless. He stepped toward the hallway, keeping to the edges of the wooden floorboards to avoid creaks. From the dim glow of a street lamp filtering through the curtains, he could see the silhouette of a figure near the back door. Another shadow shifted by the front window. 2 confirmed. The third would be nearby. Julian exhaled slowly, measuring his options. If they were professionals, they would have already checked if the house was occupied. They might assume he was asleep, making it easier for them to move quickly. A mistake. Still, he had to be careful. He wasn't the same man he used to be. His reflexes weren't as sharp. But strategy, that never faded. A floorboard creaked in the hallway. The intruder froze. For a second, neither moved. Then the shadow hesitated, taking a cautious step forward. Julian's grip on the cane tightened. He had seconds to decide. He could confront them now, drive them out before they got deeper inside. But that would reveal too much. He wasn't ready for that. Instead, he shifted his weight slightly, letting the floor groan under him again. This time, he made it deliberate, slow, enough to suggest an old man stirring in his sleep. Nothing more. The intruder paused again. Then slowly the shadow backed away. retreating toward the back door. A whisper, too low for Julian to hear, passed between the figures. Then, just as silently as they had entered, they slipped back into the night. Julian stood still for a long moment, listening as their footsteps faded into the distance. They were testing him. A trial run. They would be back. As he locked the doors and peered through the window, a familiar sensation settled into his chest. It wasn't fear. It wasn't even anger. It was something far more dangerous. Anticipation. The night stretched on, but Julian did not return to his chair. Sleep was out of the question now. He stood by the window, his eyes tracing the darkened street, every shadow a potential threat. The thieves had retreated, but they hadn't gone far. He knew their type, cautious, calculating. They wouldn't give up after just one attempt. A familiar feeling stirred inside him, not fear, but an old instinct, long buried under years of peaceful routine. Julian turned away from the window and moved toward a small cabinet near the bookshelf. He slid his fingers along the edge until he found what he was looking for, a nearly invisible seam. With a precise motion, he pressed a hidden latch. The panel popped open, revealing a small compartment. Inside, wrapped in an old cloth, lay a pistol. Unused for years, but always cleaned, always ready. He didn't take it, not yet. Instead, he closed the compartment and exhaled slowly. He had sworn never to use it again, but something told him that promise was about to be tested. Across town in a dimly lit warehouse, Diego paced back and forth. The gang leader was in his early 40s, a man who had climbed the ranks of crime through brutality and intelligence. Unlike the reckless fools who ended up in prison or dead before 30, Diego was methodical. He had built his reputation on patience, on knowing when to strike and when to wait. His men stood nearby, tense, watching him. "What happened?" he asked, his voice low but edged with steel. One of the thieves, a wiry man with nervous hands, hesitated before answering. The old man was awake. Diego narrowed his eyes. "Did he see you?" "No," the man said quickly. "But it was weird. We heard him move. But he didn't come out, didn't turn on the lights, didn't call the cops. It's like he knew we were there." Diego stopped pacing. His expression darkened. Most people, when they realized intruders were in their home, reacted with panic, fumbling for their phones, making noise, trying to scare off the thieves. But this man had done none of that. Interesting. Diego turned toward another member of his crew, a man named Lucho who had been watching silently. "You recognize the house?" Lucho thought for a moment before nodding. "Yeah, I've seen him. Old guy. Keeps to himself. Not much family. No security system. No dog. Easy target." Diego folded his arms. Then why didn't he panic? No one had an answer. For the first time in the night, Diego smiled. It was a slow, deliberate smile, the kind that never reached his eyes. "We go back," he said. "But..." The nervous thief hesitated. "If he..." Diego cut him off with a glance. "We go back," he repeated. "But this time, we find out exactly who this old man is." Back at his house, Julian stood in the dim glow of his kitchen, staring at a cup of coffee that had gone cold. His mind was elsewhere. The thieves had been careful, but not careful enough. He had caught glimpses of their movements, heard the way they whispered, measured their hesitation. They weren't common street thugs. They had discipline, a leader. Julian had dealt with men like them before. The memories came uninvited. The weight of a rifle pressed against his shoulder, the scent of gunpowder in the air, the distant echoes of commands spoken in clipped, precise tones. He had walked away from that life, but it had never truly left him. And now, it was calling him back. He reached for the pistol again, his fingers brushing against the cool metal before pulling away. Not yet. Instead, he turned off the kitchen light and moved back to his chair. If they came again, he would be ready, because men like that never gave up easily, and neither did he. Julian awoke before dawn, the remnants of old instincts guiding his body before his mind fully registered the morning. He had slept lightly, aware of every creak, every distant noise from the street. The thieves had retreated, but the tension in the air remained. As the first rays of sunlight filtered through the curtains, he rose from his chair, stretched his stiff limbs, and moved toward the front door. The street was as it always was, quiet, unassuming, but something had changed. He could feel it. Stepping outside, he scanned the surroundings with trained eyes. He had lived in this neighborhood for years and had learned to notice even the smallest disturbances. And there it was, a cigarette butt still fresh near the curb. Not from any of his neighbors, he knew their habits. Someone had been watching his house. Julian bent down, picked it up and turned it between his fingers. A cheap brand, the kind that low-level criminals favored. They had stayed close, observing, waiting. So be it. He exhaled slowly, the weight of old memories pressing against his ribs. If they wanted to test him, he would let them. But he wouldn't play the part of the frightened old man. Not anymore. Diego leaned against the hood of a stolen car, watching his men argue. They were nervous, unsettled by the failed attempt. "He's just some old man," one of them muttered. "Why waste time on this?" Diego's eyes narrowed. "Because something doesn't add up." Lucho, the most experienced of the group, nodded. "I checked around. No family, no security. But get this, there's no real history on him before he moved here. No records, no paper trail, like he appeared out of nowhere." Diego smirked. "That's not normal." The nervous thief shifted. "Maybe he's just a nobody. Or maybe," Diego said, his voice cold, "he's not." He pulled out a folded piece of paper and tossed it onto the car hood. A grainy, faded photo, a much younger Julian, dressed in tactical gear, holding a rifle with the posture of a trained marksman. Lucho whistled low. "Where'd you find this?" "Old military contacts," Diego said. "I don't have the full story yet, but it's enough." He tapped the photo. "This man isn't just some retiree." The nervous thief paled. "Then why are we messing with him?" Diego smiled, slow and dangerous. "Because now I want to see what he does." Julian spent the afternoon preparing. Not in the obvious ways. He wasn't stacking weapons or setting traps. He was simply observing. At the small grocery store down the street, he took his time selecting vegetables, all while listening to casual conversations, watching faces. He noted the strangers, men who didn't belong, lingering just a little too long near the entrance. At the park, he sat on a bench pretending to read, but his gaze flickered to the corners where a black sedan was parked for far too long. They were watching him. Good. Let them watch. By the time evening rolled around, Julian had confirmed what he already suspected. The thieves weren't finished. They were waiting, testing his reactions, trying to determine whether he was a threat or just an old man with sharp instincts. The truth was, he was both. He returned home as the sun dipped below the horizon. The house was silent, undisturbed, but there was a note on his doorstep. No envelope, no signature, just a single folded piece of paper. Julian picked it up and opened it. "Who are you?" He smiled. They were getting curious. Stepping inside, he locked the door behind him, feeling the weight of his past settling on his shoulders. He had spent years trying to be no one, but now it seemed someone had noticed. And that meant it was time to remind the world exactly who he was. Julian sat at his kitchen table, the note lying open before him. The question was simple. Who are you? But it carried the weight of something much heavier. It wasn't just a question. It was a challenge. He traced the edges of the paper with his fingers, his mind slipping back to a time he had tried to forget. The years spent behind the scope of a rifle, his breath steady, his heart slow. The missions that required silence, precision, the ghosts of those he had left behind. He had been many things, a soldier, a marksman, a ghost. But now, he was supposed to be nothing. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He moved carefully, stepping to the side before glancing through the peephole. "Rosa." Julian exhaled, unlocking the door. The older woman stood on his porch, her sharp eyes scanning him as if she already knew he was hiding something. "You've been acting strange," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Julian sighed and closed the door behind her. "I didn't know I had an audience." "You always do," Rosa said. She moved to the kitchen, her hands settling on her hips. "What's going on, Julian?" He considered lying. It would be easier. But Rosa had lived in the neighborhood for decades. She had a way of seeing through people. "There was a break-in," he admitted. Her expression darkened. "Did you call the police?" "No," she scoffed. "Of course not. You never ask for help, do you?" Julian didn't answer. Rosa watched him closely. "Are they coming back?" He nodded. "And what are you planning to do about it?" That was the question, wasn't it? He could do what any normal person would. Reinforce his locks, maybe install cameras, keep his head down. That's what a simple old man would do. But he wasn't a simple old man. Rosa crossed her arms. "I've seen the way you move, Julian. You're not just some retired schoolteacher or whatever story you tell people." Julian's lips pressed into a thin line. And what do you think I am? I don't know, she admitted. But I do know that you're not afraid, and that worries me. Julian glanced back at the note on the table. The truth was he wasn't afraid. Not of the thieves, not of what would come next. He was afraid of what it would mean if he let himself become the man he used to be. They don't know who they're dealing with, Rosa said quietly. Julian met her gaze. Neither do you. A beat of silence passed between them. Then, Rosa's expression softened, just slightly. Then maybe it's time I find out. Julian looked away. I don't want trouble. Too late for that. She leaned forward. So tell me, Julian, what's your next move? He had spent years running from his past, trying to live a life of quiet obscurity, but trouble had found him anyway. He could walk away, pretend this was just another random crime, but deep down he knew better. This wasn't over, not until someone put an end to it. Julian had a choice to make, and he already knew what it would be. Julian stood in the dim light of his living room long after Rosa had left. The question she had asked still lingered in his mind. What's your next move? He had spent his life avoiding that question, burying the part of himself that once answered it without hesitation. But now the choice was slipping away from him. The thieves would return. Diego would push. And when that happened, Julian would have to be ready. The next morning, as he stepped onto his porch, Rosa was already waiting. I brought you coffee, she said, handing him a thermos. Julian took it, raising an eyebrow. What's the occasion? Rosa leaned against the railing, watching the quiet street. I did some asking around. Julian tensed. And? There have been other break-ins. Some people didn't report them, but I hear things. She sipped her own coffee. Diego has been looking for an easy target. Julian exhaled. I figured. But here's what I don't understand, Rosa continued. Why are they so interested in you? Julian didn't answer. Rosa set down her cup. I know you, Julian. You keep to yourself, but you're not ordinary. The way you move, the way you listen, you see things other people don't. Julian met her gaze. And what do you want to do about it? She smiled faintly. I want to help. Julian chuckled. Help? Rosa, this isn't your fight. She shrugged. Maybe not, but it's our neighborhood, and I don't trust the police to handle this. Julian considered her words. He had spent his life working alone. But he wasn't just protecting himself now. Diego's men weren't just a threat to him. They were a threat to everyone around him. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't fighting just for himself. Later that evening, a knock on the door startled him. Julian opened it to find a younger man standing on the porch. He recognized him. Carlos, Rosa's nephew. Mid-30s, stocky build, the kind of man who had seen a fight or two. Tia Rosa said you might need help, Carlos said. Julian studied him. You know what's happening? Carlos nodded. I've heard about Diego. People are scared, but they won't do anything about it. And you? Carlos grinned. I don't scare easy. Julian sighed, stepping aside. Come in. Carlos entered, glancing around the modest home. You really think they're coming back? I don't think, Julian corrected. I know. Carlos folded his arms. So, what's the plan? Julian hesitated. It had been a long time since anyone had asked him that, but if he was going to do this, he needed to stop pretending he wasn't who he was. We prepare, he said. Carlos nodded. Good. Then let's get started. Julian watched the younger man for a moment, then allowed himself the faintest smile. He wasn't alone in this, not anymore. And when Diego came back, he wouldn't find an easy target. He would find a war. The air in the neighborhood had changed. Julian could feel it. The weight of unseen eyes, the tension in the way people moved. The streets were quieter than usual, conversations hushed. Fear had settled in, and Diego thrived on it. Julian spent the next few days watching, listening. Carlos had been right. The people here wouldn't fight back. They were good people, but they weren't fighters. And Diego was counting on that. One evening, Rosa rushed to Julian's house, breathless. They hit the mercado, she said, her voice sharp with anger. Julian's jaw tightened. The mercado was a small family-owned grocery store, one of the few places that had stood in the neighborhood for decades. He grabbed his jacket. Show me. When they arrived, the damage was clear. Shelves overturned, glass shattered. The owner, a man in his late 50s named Hector, stood outside, shaking his head as he spoke with a few concerned neighbors. Julian approached. What happened? Hector sighed. They came in just before closing. Diego's men. Said it was time for me to contribute to the neighborhood. He clenched his fists. I told them no. Julian looked at the damage. And this was their answer? Hector nodded. Said they'd be back for more. Julian exhaled. The attacks were escalating. Diego was tightening his grip, testing how far he could go before someone pushed back. Rosa crossed her arms. So? Are we just going to let this happen? Hector scoffed. What can we do? The police won't help. Julian met Rosa's gaze, then looked at Hector. Maybe it's time we helped ourselves. That night, Carlos returned, his expression grim. They're making their move, he said. Diego's sending a message. Julian had expected as much. Where? Carlos hesitated. They're going after Rosa. Julian's breath stilled for a fraction of a second. Then he was already moving. How many? 3, maybe 4. Julian grabbed his coat and stepped outside. The cool night air did nothing to calm the fire building inside him. Carlos followed. We should call someone. We're not calling anyone, Julian said. His voice was quiet, but there was no mistaking the steel beneath it. This was what Diego wanted, to push him, to see what he would do. Fine, let him see. They arrived at Rosa's house in time to hear the sound of a struggle. Julian moved fast, faster than any man his age should. The front door was slightly ajar. Inside, voices. He motioned for Carlos to stay back, then stepped inside. 3 men, one near the hallway, one by the kitchen, and one gripping Rosa's wrist. The man in the hallway turned first, his eyes widening as he registered Julian. Who the hell? Julian moved. A single step forward, then his cane, heavy, solid wood, lashed out. The first man barely had time to react before the impact struck his ribs, sending him staggering into the wall. The second man moved next, reaching for something at his waist. A knife. Julian didn't give him the chance. He pivoted, gripping the wrist mid-motion and twisting. The knife clattered to the floor as the man yelped in pain. A quick shove sent him tumbling into the kitchen table. The third man, still gripping Rosa, froze. Julian met his gaze. Let her go. For a second, hesitation. Then, the man shoved Rosa aside and bolted for the door. Carlos was waiting. A quick punch to the gut dropped him instantly. Julian turned back to Rosa. Are you hurt? She shook her head, breathless but steady. I'm fine. Carlos exhaled, rolling his shoulders. That was fast. Julian didn't respond. His mind was already somewhere else. This wasn't over. Diego had made his move. Now, it was Julian's turn. Julian stood outside Rosa's house, staring at the night sky. The quiet hum of the city beyond the neighborhood felt distant, almost unreal. His heart had slowed back to its usual steady rhythm, but his mind was already ahead, calculating, planning. Diego had forced his hand. Carlos exhaled beside him. So, what now? Julian didn't answer immediately. Instead, he watched the street, the dim lights flickering against the pavement. They'll come back, he finally said. They won't take this lightly. Carlos scoffed. Then let's hit them first. Julian shook his head. No, we're not thugs. We don't attack blindly. He turned to Carlos. We prepare. Carlos nodded, waiting for instructions. Julian glanced toward Rosa, who was standing just outside her doorway. We need people. This isn't just about me anymore. Diego is taking over this neighborhood piece by piece. If we let him, we lose. Rosa stepped forward. People are scared, Julian. Julian met her gaze. Then we give them something else, a reason to fight back. The next day, Julian and Carlos moved quietly through the neighborhood, speaking to people who had suffered under Diego's reign. Hector, the store owner. Luis, the mechanic whose shop had been vandalized. Sophia, a single mother threatened when she refused to pay Diego's tax. One by one they listened, and one by one they saw the shift, the flicker of something deeper than fear. Anger. Carlos leaned in after one of their meetings. They want to fight. Julian nodded. Then we give them the means to do it. By nightfall, they had gathered a small group behind Hector's store. Julian looked at them. Ordinary people, none of them fighters. But courage wasn't about training, it was about choice. We don't pick this fight, he told them. It came to us, and now we decide what happens next. Hector crossed his arms. What's the plan? Julian stepped forward. Diego controls through fear. That's his strength. His eyes scanned the group. So we take it from him, Sophia frowned. How? Julian gestured to the streets. We take back what's ours. We stand together. We don't let his men walk freely. We don't let them intimidate us. We make it clear, this neighborhood is not theirs. A murmur of agreement rippled through the group. Carlos smirked. You want a war of presence? Julian nodded. That's how you beat men like Diego. Not with brute force, but with certainty. They need to feel watched, hunted. Hector cracked his knuckles. I like it. Julian met his gaze. Then let's get to work. By the next evening, the shift was already in motion. When Diego's men walked the streets, they no longer saw fear in the eyes of the people. Instead, they saw defiance. Neighbors stood outside their homes watching. Groups gathered in front of stores, not moving when Diego's men passed. Doors that once shut quickly now remained open, people stepping out just to look. Julian watched from a distance, unseen but present. Fear was shifting. Carlos nudged him. They're rattled. Julian allowed a small smile. Good. But deep down he knew Diego wouldn't take this lightly. The real fight was coming. And he would be ready. Diego sat in the back of a dimly lit bar, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the wooden table. The air smelled of cheap alcohol and cigarette smoke, but he barely noticed. His mind was elsewhere, replaying the events of the past few days. Something had changed. Fear was a currency he had spent years perfecting. A whisper here, a threat there. It was usually enough. But now it was slipping. His men reported back with unease. The people in the neighborhood weren't hiding anymore. They weren't avoiding eye contact, weren't stepping aside when his crew passed. They were standing firm, watching, like they were waiting for something. Diego took a slow drag from his cigarette before speaking. Tell me, Lucho, why do you think they suddenly grew a spine? Lucho, standing near the table, hesitated. It's the old man. Diego exhaled, watching the smoke curl through the air. I figured. He's organizing them, Lucho continued. People are talking. They say he used to be something else, someone dangerous. Diego smirked. Is that so? Lucho shifted. Maybe we should move on. There are other neighborhoods, easier ones. Diego's smile faded. He flicked the cigarette away and stood. You think I built my reputation by running? Lucho swallowed hard. Diego stepped closer. If this old man wants a fight, we give him one. But first, he pulled out his phone, scrolling to a contact. He needs a warning. Julian was locking up his house when his phone rang. A number he didn't recognize. He let it ring twice before answering. Yes? A pause. Then a voice. Smooth. Calculated. You've been busy, abuelo. Julian's grip tightened. He recognized that voice. He had heard voices like that before, men who thought control was their birthright. Diego. A chuckle. So, you do know who I am. Julian said nothing. Diego continued. I have to say I admire the effort. Getting the neighborhood to stand up, making my guys nervous. It's almost impressive. Julian remained silent, letting Diego talk. But here's the thing, Diego went on, his tone darkening. I don't like losing control, and I really don't like people thinking they can challenge me. Julian finally spoke. Then maybe you should pick a different career. A beat of silence, then a low laugh. You've got guts, old man. Diego's voice turned cold. But I think you need a reminder of how this works. Julian's fingers curled around the phone. What did you do? Another chuckle. Why don't you go check on your friends? The line went dead. Julian didn't hesitate. He grabbed his coat and stepped outside, already dialing Rosa's number. No answer. His pulse quickened as he moved quickly through the dark streets, his footsteps quiet but urgent. The neighborhood was still, but something felt off. Then he saw it. Hector's store. The front window shattered. The door left hanging open. Inside, shelves overturned, food scattered across the floor. Julian stepped inside, his eyes scanning for movement. A groan. He turned toward the sound and found Hector on the ground, clutching his side. Blood stained his shirt. Julian knelt beside him. Can you breathe? Hector coughed, nodding weakly. Just a warning, he muttered. They said, this was for you. Julian's jaw clenched. He helped Hector sit up, checking the wound. It wasn't deep, painful but not fatal. Carlos rushed in a moment later, his face tight with anger. Bastards. Julian stood, his body still, but his mind moving fast. Diego had given his warning. Now it was Julian's turn. He met Carlos's gaze. It's time. Carlos nodded. For what? Julian's expression was unreadable. We end this. Julian moved through the dark streets with a silent purpose, his mind clearer than it had been in years. The hesitation, the reluctance to return to the man he once was, it was gone. Diego had crossed a line, and now there was no going back. Carlos walked beside him, his energy restless. "How do you want to do this?" Julian kept his voice steady. "We control the battlefield." Carlos frowned. "Diego's got more men." Julian nodded. "That's why we don't fight on his terms." They had spent the past week preparing, reinforcing the neighborhood's unity. Diego had expected resistance, but what he didn't expect was strategy. Julian had spent a lifetime analyzing enemies, predicting their movements. He had done it in places far more dangerous than this. Diego and his men would be expecting a fight. What they wouldn't expect was to lose control of the very streets they thought they owned. Tonight, they would learn. At a small warehouse near the edge of the neighborhood, Diego stood with his men. He was growing impatient. The attack on Hector's store had been a message, and yet the old man hadn't run. If anything, Julian had become bolder. The people in the neighborhood had stopped fearing Diego's men. That wasn't how this was supposed to go. Diego exhaled sharply, rolling his shoulders. "He's coming," he said to Lucho, his second in command. "I want him alive." Lucho hesitated. "Alive?" Diego smirked. "I want to know what makes this old bastard so dangerous." Lucho nodded. "And if he resists?" Diego's eyes darkened. "Then make sure he regrets it." Julian arrived first, stepping into the open space in front of the warehouse. The night air was thick with tension. Carlos stayed hidden, waiting for the signal. Diego emerged from the shadows, his men forming a loose semicircle behind him. The gang leader smirked. "Didn't think you'd actually show up." Julian's gaze remained steady. "I wanted to see you in person before this ends." Diego chuckled. "Ends? You're outnumbered. You're alone." Julian's expression didn't change. "You think so?" As if on cue, movement flickered in the shadows. The people of the neighborhood, ordinary men and women, had taken their positions. Some had gathered along the rooftops, watching. Others stood in the alleyways, blocking exits. Diego noticed them. His smirk faltered. Julian took a slow step forward. "You made one mistake, Diego." Diego tilted his head, masking his unease. "And what's that?" "You thought I was alone." Silence. For the first time, Diego's confidence wavered. He had expected a direct fight, maybe even a desperate attempt by Julian to take him out. But this was different. His men started shifting, glancing around, realizing they were surrounded, not by armed mercenaries, but by the very people they had terrorized. Diego gritted his teeth. "Do you think a bunch of scared shopkeepers and old ladies are going to stop me?" Julian finally allowed himself the faintest smile. "No, I am." Diego barely had time to react before Julian moved. A blur of motion, faster than any 68-year-old should be. His cane lashed out, catching the nearest thug in the knee. The man dropped with a cry. Before the others could react, Carlos struck from the side, taking down another with a precise hit to the ribs. Chaos erupted. Diego's men scrambled to regain control, but something was different. They had always relied on fear to win their fights. Now, fear was no longer on their side. Julian ducked a wild swing, his body reacting out of memory. He drove his cane into another attacker's gut, sending him sprawling. Diego stepped back, eyes wide. He hadn't expected this. Julian locked eyes with him, his expression calm, controlled. "This is your last chance," he said. "Walk away." Diego clenched his jaw. He wasn't a man who walked away. He was a man who set traps. And tonight, Julian had walked right into one. Julian barely had time to register the shift before he heard it. Movement behind him, quick and precise. A trap. Diego's smirk returned as two more of his men emerged from the darkness, dragging someone forward. Rosa. Her arms were pinned behind her back, her face bruised but defiant. The moment Julian saw her, his body went rigid. Diego's voice was smooth, amused. "You really thought I wouldn't have a backup plan?" Julian's fingers tightened around his cane, but he forced himself to remain still. Reacting too soon would only get Rosa killed. Carlos muttered under his breath, "Damn it." The tension in the air was thick. The neighborhood fighters had gained the upper hand, but this changed everything. Diego gestured lazily toward Rosa. "You think you're the only one who can play tactics, old man? You surrounded me, sure. You turned my men into cowards. But here's the thing." He stepped closer to Rosa, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I don't need an army to win." Julian's heartbeat was steady, controlled. His mind worked fast. If Diego thought this would break him, he was mistaken. But the risk was real. Rosa was tough, but she was vulnerable. Diego sighed dramatically. So here's my offer, Abuelo. You drop this act, tell your little neighborhood army to stand down, and I let her go. Julian's face remained unreadable. And then what? Diego grinned. Then you disappear, leave town, let me run things my way, no more problems. Julian exhaled slowly. Diego was watching him, waiting for hesitation. Instead, Julian did something unexpected. He smiled. Diego's smirk faltered. What? Julian took a step forward, speaking low. You don't understand, do you? Diego frowned. Understand what? Julian tilted his head slightly. That I've already won. The words barely had time to sink in before a sudden sharp whistle cut through the air. A signal. Diego turned instinctively. Too late. From the rooftops, from the alleyways, from the very streets themselves, the neighborhood struck. They weren't fighters in the traditional sense, but they were many, and they were ready. One of Diego's men barely had time to react before he was pulled back into the shadows by two furious shopkeepers. Another was disarmed by a teenager with a baseball bat. The people had stopped being afraid. Diego turned back to Julian, fury in his eyes. He yanked Rosa forward, gripping her arm tightly. I swear I'll... Rosa moved first. She stomped hard on Diego's foot, making him lose his balance for half a second. Half a second was all Julian needed. His cane swung in an arc, striking Diego's wrist with perfect precision. Diego yelped, releasing Rosa. Julian followed through with a second strike, this time to the side of Diego's knee. The gang leader collapsed. Carlos lunged forward, knocking away the knife Diego had tried to reach for. Suddenly, Diego was on the ground, breath heaving, looking up at the man he had underestimated. Julian towered over him, his cane resting against Diego's chest. You lost, Julian said simply. Diego gritted his teeth, refusing to accept it. You think this changes anything? Julian leaned in. I know it does. Around them, Diego's men were either unconscious, restrained, or fleeing. The neighborhood had risen, and they weren't backing down. Diego swallowed hard. For the first time in years, he was the one feeling fear. Julian straightened, glancing at Carlos. Call the police. Diego laughed bitterly. You think they'll keep me locked up? Julian's eyes darkened. No, but they'll keep you out of here. Carlos smirked. And if you come back, we'll be waiting. Diego said nothing. He knew the truth. He had lost control, and in his world, losing control meant the end. As the sounds of sirens grew in the distance, Julian turned away. His job was done. For now, the night had changed everything. By the time the police arrived, Diego and his remaining men were already broken, some arrested, others vanishing into the night, knowing their rule was over. The neighborhood stood together, watching as the flashing lights painted their streets in red and blue. There was no fear anymore, no silence. Julian leaned against a wall, his body sore but steady. Rosa approached, rubbing her wrist where Diego had grabbed her. You all right? Julian nodded. You? She smirked. Never better. Carlos joined them, shaking his head. Hell of a night. Julian glanced around, taking in the faces of those who had fought back. People who had once been afraid now stood taller, knowing they had taken their home back. Think Diego's really done? Carlos asked. Julian exhaled. For now. But men like Diego always had replacements. The cycle never truly ended. Still, the message had been sent. This neighborhood was no longer easy prey. Rosa studied him. You're different now. Julian allowed a small smile. Maybe I just remembered who I was. She nodded. So, what now? Julian looked up at the sky, the first light of dawn creeping over the rooftops. The past had come knocking and he had answered, but he wasn't the same man anymore. I think I'll enjoy the quiet, he said. Carlos chuckled. Until the next fight? Julian smiled, stepping toward his home. If that time comes, he said, I'll be ready. As he closed his door, the neighborhood was still, but this time it was a different kind of silence. Not fear, strength. And for the first time in years, Julian truly felt at home.